And now to the topic of the hour. Without further ado, please give your warmest remote welcome to our speakers. Go ahead and share your screen, Sarah.
All right, are we good to go, Haley?
There we go, looks great.
Okay, great, thank you so much. And yeah, thanks PFI for having us be able to present today. My name is Sarah Nizzi, and I am a Farm Bill Pollinator Conservation Planner and NRCS Partner Biologist. And when I say NRCS, I mean the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is a branch of USDA. I am in normal times based out of the Dallas County field office, but currently have been working from home in Boone County for the last several months. I work with producers and landowners to implement diverse native habitat to benefit pollinators and other wildlife. I also train and assist NRCS staff and partner staff with basically everything all-encompassing pollinators, from their biology to their habitat requirements, while also helping to educate and expand the knowledge of natural resource management. So that can be, site prep, weed control, plant ID, seed mixes. I feel like I wear a lot of hats and also provide education and outreach. Oh, let's see. There we go. All right, so the Xerces Society is a nonprofit, an international nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon, and we work to preserve wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. Invertebrates are keystone species, so if we are helping them, we are helping everything else below that benefits from their services. The bulk of our staff is within our pollinator team, and we work within the agricultural landscape to diversify that landscape on the ground and implement or enhance existing habitat. We also have an endangered species team that does a really phenomenal job of giving voice to all of the critters out there that are often underrepresented. And we have a small but very mighty pesticide team who keeps us well informed about all the latest happenings within the pesticide realm, and a few individuals that work within cities and towns and on campuses to implement pollinator habitat in the urban landscape. So as mentioned, our pollinator team is the bulk of our staff. Nearly half of us fall into that category. And although we work within the agricultural landscape, we come at it from different angles. So like myself, I am part of the public sector as a NRCS partner biologist on the state level. We also have partner biologists that work regionally. And then the others not within the public sector are working with private companies and private growers. But we are all over the place, and I know we have a diverse audience and people that are tuning in outside of the Midwest. So if you see stars within your area and you're interested in any habitat work, feel free to reach out to them via our website. And I think it's no secret that in the last decade or more, it's been increasingly tough for insects and biodiversity altogether. And publicly, it's just thrown at us all the time. There's headlines constantly talking about the insect apocalypse, the bees are hurting, etc. And it's true. Where studied diversity, abundance, and biomass of insects and other invertebrates are decreasing, and this is happening globally. And although we welcome more research and more data based off of what we know now, we do know enough that we should be taking conservation action steps now. And what is really neat is that we can take conservation action steps at a wide range of scale. So from backyards all the way to managed land that is several acres, for example, every little bit counts. And we also know that when, for example, our beneficial insects are declining, there are a number of pests just waiting in line to take their place. And then we are left with issues that we hadn't seen coming, and a number of different issues, and we then have to spend time, money, and resources trying to combat those problems. And insects can tend to get a bad rap as far as whether they're annoying or gross or what have you. They really are the things that make the world go round. And only 2% of described insects are considered pests, and the other 98% or so are beneficial to ecosystems and humans. And within the beneficial insect group, there is a vast diversity of species out there. We have predatory wasps, parasitoid wasps, ground beetles, tiger beetles, rove beetles, lady beetles, fireflies are even considered beneficial insects, and they all bring unique skill sets to the table. Lacewings, which are pictured at the upper left here, are rather dainty in appearance, but they are quite ferocious predators. They are able to be active in low temperatures and low lights when other predators may be laying dormant or not as active. Flower flies, also known as hover flies or syrphid flies, they're beneficial insects as larvae. They're predaceous, but once they go through their complete metamorphosis, they then become pollinators, where they're foraging on pollen and nectar. So really diverse group of insects. And again, they provide many ecosystem services to us. They can diversify a farm, they can reduce management costs, they can reduce those unintended consequences. They're beneficial to ecosystems and so on, and can, in some cases, research has shown, be an alternative to insecticides. And we know that pests require very little in order to thrive. They do not need very much. But if we want to have natural enemies and beneficial insects, we, the tier is a bit higher, and we have to raise the bar in order to provide that habitat. Habitat is key. And again, it's the #1 conservation action anyone can take at almost any scale in order to reverse these declines. But in order to provide habitat, you want to be sure that you have your nesting cover, your food, breeding opportunities, which basically means, being sure that they can find one another in close proximity, and overwintering sites. In terms of pollinator conservation, we often spend a lot of time focusing on flowers and providing food, which is really important. But what is overlooked in a lot of cases is that nesting and overwintering component. And that's not only beneficial to pollinators, but that goes for our natural enemies. If we are not providing all 3 of those, then they are not able to fulfill their whole life cycle, which is critical. All right, so that was a pretty broad overview of kind of what's going on in the world and beneficial insects. So now we're going to get into the habitat component, and beetle banks are just one way to provide habitat on a farm. The idea originated in the UK. They had once utilized native hedgerows to provide this habitat, but those had been wiped out. So they decided to implement beetle banks in their place, and they've had great success with that. Beetle banks have been adopted and are currently in use, and there's been research and many projects within the US, kind of early on with the Pacific Northwest, but there are projects in the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, and certainly within the Midwest. It's becoming increasingly popular, and many people are interested in kind of experimenting with this novel habitat type. So they are long linear strips planted either within or adjacent to crops. They are intended to be long-term habitat enhancements. So you want to be sure with that placement that you're pretty serious about it. You don't want to have to till it up later down the road. And the overarching goal of beetle banks is to provide shelter, particularly for ground beetles and other beneficial insects. Traditionally, they have always been planted with just native bunch grasses, like the picture shown here. But at Xerces, we have been experimenting with adding a wildflower component just to ensure that we are supporting not only beneficial insects, but also pollinators. And ironically, I just got an email from a colleague this morning, and there is new research just hot off the press that supports adding diversity to beetle banks, because although beneficial insects, can prey upon certain pests are not out all the time. They kind of have their peaks and ebbs and flows, and they need that alternate food source, which often is pollen and nectar. So that's pretty cool. The rest of this list is really kind of generally speaking and is a case-by-case scenario. Every farm's going to be different, the size, equipment available, etc. And without further ado, I'm going to transfer over to Jake, who is going to explain how Grow Johnson County planned and installed their awesome beetle banks.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you all this morning. Thanks, PFI, for transitioning to this virtual option here so we can all still get together and share some on-farm knowledge while all making sure we're safe and able to make it to next year. I'm looking forward to another potluck, and I'm really hoping that we can do another whole hog roast again at that potluck. So that's my little review for the conference. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm Jake Kundert. I'm the Food Systems Director at the Iowa Valley RC&D. We're a nonprofit based in Amana. And as part of that role, I work with a team to manage the Grow Johnson County farm in Iowa City. So this farm project began in 2016 as a way to improve access to healthy food within the community and provide educational opportunities for local growers who wanted to learn more about sustainable practices in vegetable production. So we've gotten to a point now where we're about 5 acres that we rent from the Johnson County Board of Supervisors on this 160-acre property, which has been owned by the county since the mid-1800s. So you can kind of see up closer to the buildings in the top part of this photo, you can see kind of the more vegetable looking kind of bed shape. That's where we're at. To the left of us is the land access program. To the kind of down to the right from us is the Global Food Project, another local initiative. You can see the crop ground that still exists on the farm, but is kind of being slowly transitioned away from that. And then the green area just above the woods is all a pollinator habitat, pollinator palooza. So why did we get into beetle banks? It actually began with another beetle called the Colorado potato beetle. And at every farm that I've worked on, I always drew the short straw and was the guy that had to go out and walk the long rows in the hot sun and squish Colorado potato beetles. And if you've done this before, you get to the end and you're all sweaty and your hands are that gross, like brown orange from squishing them all. So I have been looking for ways to not do that anymore. And of course we spray for them too, but I don't really like doing that either. So we were looking for more holistic ways to address some of the pest issues on the farm. So 2018, we went to a PFI field day at Grinnell Heritage Farm. And we were looking at, it was actually with Xerces, looking at all these different kinds of habitats on their farm. So we looked at the hedgerows they put in, this cool kind of pollinator prairie area. And then we get to these beetle banks. And I was just shocked at how small they are and how they're fully established. They're these big, tall, beautiful native grasses. It just looks really cool. It was in the field. And then Andy says, and yeah, since we've had these established, we're not having to spray for Colorado potato beetles anymore. And that was like the light that went off in my head that why aren't we doing this? It's not a lot of land. We can add some diversity to the farm. And then these little critters, you give them a place to live and they're going to go out and do work for us. So from then on, I was kind of set on figuring out how to put this on our farm. And I saw Andy was in the room here. So shout out to Andy for the inspiration on this. Okay, next slide. So as part of this too, I'm going to blame the Xerces Society for indoctrinating me into the world of beetles. Since putting this in, I've been kind of a little bit of a fanatic about beetles. So I'm gonna, in addition to talking about beetle banks that we put in on the farm, I'm gonna share with you some of the interesting things that I've learned about beetles through this whole process. So beetles are just this fantastic critter. They actually make up 25% of the entire animal kingdom. There's like 400,000 species of beetles, and they are incredibly diverse. They're believed to be one of the most diverse critter on Earth. There's some discussion about maybe parasitoid wasps are actually more diverse, but I'm on team beetle. So I think they're just fascinating, and there's a ton of them that are native to Iowa, and they can be really helpful on farms. So in this presentation, if you want to go to the next slide, it's kind of broken up into 3 discussions here about beetle banks. Going to talk about preparation that we did, talk about the planting season, how we planted and managed them in the first year, and then what we've done ongoing for the management. So when it comes to planting, Sarah mentioned this a little bit. The first thing that we were trying to work with was putting together the species list, thinking about what we wanted to do for the ratio of grass to forbs. As Sarah mentioned, the traditional beetle bank is just fully bunch grasses, but we wanted to kind of explore how we can be adding in all kinds of different forbs that were able to cover the entire bloom length of the season. So having flowers that bloomed in spring, in the summer, in the fall, and also species that we liked. So I think about what Mark Cui always says about wanting to work in a beautiful place. And so we just looked at species that we like. So I love rattlesnake master. So I want to make sure that that's included. Love compass plant, want to make sure that's included. So I'd encourage you, if you're making decisions about what to add to your mix, that you think about what plants you like to see, because they're going to be there for a long time. I'm not going to touch on everything here, but these are just some things that you could think about, and I'd be happy to talk more about those later on. We opted for going with plugs versus seed, and we kind of justified that added cost because we felt like we're a vegetable farm. We do a lot of things from transplant, so we knew that system, and we had all of our equipment set up to be able to work within that system. So for us, not being familiar with putting in beetle banks or much habitat at all, we felt pretty comfortable in just the strategy to be able to do that because we do it with all of our plants, or most of our plants on the farm. And we felt like the ease of establishment and the rate of establishment was going to be faster, so we could start getting the benefits of those beetles at a faster rate. The other main thing to think about is how much you want to do, how much you feel comfortable managing, and be prepared for managing, for that establishment period, and how much of that you feel like you're comfortable with doing. And then kind of the big things that I'll get into next are talking about the sequence of things that we did leading up to planting, and then site prep, and then our weed management plan. So we opted to do 4 beetle banks. The 2 on the left, so the red lines are where the beetle banks are. The 2 on the left are 375 feet, and then the 2 that are perpendicular to those are 300 feet. We went with a 40-inch bed top, and that ends up being about 5-foot wide bed when you account for tire tracks of the tractor. On our farm with our vegetables, we have primarily 2 spacing systems. We do a 3-row 15-inch in-row space or between row spacing, and a 2-row 30-inch bed spacing. And then we have a water wheel transplanter that will plant at 6-inch. We'll leave 6-inch holes. So we figured with this, what would match closest to the general recommendations about planting natives was that we would do this 3-row system, 12-inch in-row spacing, and then 15-inch between row spacing. And then we separated them out. So we wanted to do tall stature plants and short stature plants. And to be able to allow space for those shorter stature plants to thrive and not be competed against by the taller stature plants, we separated them out into their own areas. So the outside thirds of the beetle banks were short, the middle third was tall. And so that kind of made our planning get a little bit more complicated, but I think it was the right choice to do there. This is our planting list. We'd be happy to share this afterwards, but the main thing I wanted to show you with this is from a species side of things, it's mostly forbs, but from a quantity side of things, it's primarily grasses. So it's about 2/3 grass and sedge species. And even with that, of the entire list, it's primarily these 3 species, little blue stem, June grass, and drop seed. So that makes up about 40% of the entire planting. And those 3 species make up 2/3 of the short planting, which becomes important with the planting process. And so I went a little nuts with Excel spreadsheets, I'll be honest. But I feel like this was important to be able to plan. So we're going to get 4,000 plants that are just going to show up on the farm. And we need to figure out how to organize them, how to put them out in the field, and how to plant them based on our planting plan. One thing I'm going to mention here on the top left is the pricing of this. So we did a little over 4,000 plants, and we got them from a place called Minnesota Native Landscape, who grew them all out for us. And they charge about $1, a little more than $1 a plant. So it's not the cheapest thing in the world, especially compared to if you did it from seed. But we felt like the lower time in management, the faster rate of getting them established, and kind of a few other things that we were thinking about really helped make that decision to decide to go with the cost of this. So you might be asking, why do all these fancy Excel spreadsheets? And I'll tell you, if you want to pull up my box there. So there's a couple things that I felt like was important with the planning to do this. So we want to make sure that we didn't run out of plants. I was pretty sure that I knew the length and the spacing of all these beetle banks to make it so we knew that we'd get enough plants. But you're never sure until you get to the end. And so I wanted to make sure that we didn't get to the end and be out of plants. So I wanted to make sure that I knew within each beetle bank how many trays were going to go into each one, and even within each section of short or tall, how many trays were going to go into each one. I want to make sure I knew where to put my flags to measure the short versus tall sections, and I wanted to be able to account for the diversity in each. So you want to spread out the diversity. That's why it's different from planting from seed, where the seed mix already accounts for diversity and you just spread it in the area. This, we're actually intentionally planting in diversity into the beds. So we wanted to make sure that we were accounting that, so we knew that X number of short forb species were going to go into each section. And then importantly, I mentioned that those 3 species were, those 3 short bunchgrass species make up the predominant species of this whole planting. So we wanted to make sure that we knew what we could plant mechanically, or kind of mechanically. Okay. So this is our first break for a beetle story. This is my favorite beetle. It's called the dung beetle. And the reason I think it's fascinating, so these dung beetles, they, so this specific one is the South African dung beetle. When an animal drops dung on the ground, these beetles run up, they make a ball, they run away, and then they feed that dung to their larvae. It's a very competitive process, and it's a high energy process. So these beetles, when they roll it up and they start running away, there's competitor beetles hanging out around the dung pile that want to steal it from them. So they want to get away from that dung pile as fast as possible. And what they found is that these dung beetles know how to go in straight lines away from that dung pile, but they're going backwards. So how do they know how to do that? So scientists figured out that during the day, these beetles have these receptors on their head that can see polarized light coming off of the sun that goes in these concentric circles, and they use that to go straight. But they also go straight at night. So they wanted to know, how the hell do these beetles go straight at night? And so they figured out that these things follow the stars. They follow the Milky Way. So they took these beetles, they put them in a planetarium where they could change the direction of the Milky Way, and they still followed whatever the Milky Way was at. So I think that's fascinating, and that's why it's my favorite beetle. Okay, back to beetle banks. So this is just a timeline of what we did. So we did all of our site prep in the same year. So if you want to do it a year before, you could silage tarp the area and kind of do your prep then. We did our initial tillage of these beds in like May, June. It was a really wet spring, so it was kind of a challenge getting the site prep done. So this is a 5-foot tiller. We went through and tilled those beds in May, June. Excuse me, and then we came back 2 or 3 times in July and August and did just a kind of a shallow pass to kill whatever was coming up. And we used this, this is just a bent piece of metal that forms the 40-inch bed top and raises it up a little bit off the ground, which is kind of a design point of the beetle banks. We planted on July 29th, and then we ended up, it didn't rain, of course, so we put out drip lines and irrigated them a couple times. And then I came through and made a cultivation pass in mid-September, waited like 10 or 14 days to let them root in. And then I made another 1 or 2 sometime between into early October, so right before it started getting to a frost point. And then we were monitoring the heaving of the plants. So if they don't have enough time to root down in the ground, as it gets cold and there's the freeze thaw cycle, it'll actually push those plants out of the ground. So you got to make sure that they're rooted in well. So that was the photo of us of the tillage. And so this was what it looked like actually the day we planted. So we had done a couple stale bed passes, and this is what it looked like right before. So we came through again and tilled that right before planting. So our planting process, I mentioned we have these 3 bunchgrass species that make up the predominant amount of our entire species list, and it makes up 2/3 of our short section. So that was an opportunity for us to go and plant those with just our small staff. So me, my coworker Michi Lopez, and then Jason Grimm driving the tractor went out with our water wheel. I mentioned those drums, they'll set 6-inch spacing, and then they're 15 inches apart. And this is what we use to plant all of our vegetable transplants. So we know we could go out with those 3 species and plant. And since it made up 2/3 of those short sections, we knew we could plant 2 in a row and then skip 1 and then plant 2 in a row. And that skipped one would be what we would come back and plant later on. So we have all these forbs that's like 1 tray of something. And so we could come back and plant those individually to build in the diversity in the planting. We arranged, so I said we got short and tall. We flagged out in the beds, short sections had yellow flags, tall sections had pink flags. And then we had hay racks with all the plants on them. And those hay racks had like 15 of those colored flags on them. So nobody knew, everybody was very clear what was short and what was tall and where it was going to go. And then we asked, so we planted this, the 3 of us went through, it took maybe an hour or 2 to plant, you know, all these short bunch grasses. And then we had a group of volunteers come and then plant the rest of it. And when they came, we asked them to take kind of the base tray, which fits 36 plants, and they're all in 6-cell little packs. So we said, take an empty tray and then grab 6 different species into that tray and then take it out into the bed and plant it. And then when you're planting, be accounting for not planting the same species in a row, but kind of spreading them out to build in that diversity. Okay. So then we planted it this way because we wanted to try doing mechanical cultivation on this. And that was going to just make it so the establishment was a lot easier. We didn't have to worry as much about weeds. So we have a Case 265 belly mount tractor that we use to do all of our mechanical cultivation. And it has a belly mount, and we have these Tillmore implements on it. So we did, I mentioned we did the I waited like 10 or 14 days for the plants to get rooted, and then I came back through with the tractor. So on the outside rows, we have finger weeders, which are designed to get in-row weeds. And then on the inside, I use these, they're called tender plant knives. It's just kind of like a beet knife. And the reason I did that is because the weeds got a little bit bigger than I was hoping they were going to. And we also had some thistle come in. So I wanted something a little bit more aggressive that was going to knock that stuff back in the inside rows, while also using the finger weeders to get the in-row weeds on those 2 exterior rows. Yeah, so it's a little choppy, but this is always, I love watching this video because I can see mechanically cultivating out the thistles, which just always makes me happy. But I'm happy to share this with anyone later on. But we went through, and then was just going to show you we have a rear mount. I was concerned about making sure that we had really, we'd really cultivated the tire tracks, because I didn't want that sod that's coming from the field road to come into that. So I wanted to make that a really delineated line. So you'll see that it kind of, these S-tines rip up a chunk of sod there. So you go to the next slide, it worked pretty well. The left is before, the right is after. You can see that there's a pretty nice crumble in row on those bunch grasses. And the middle row, it got cleaned up pretty well. So I don't know, I'd say it worked pretty well. I might change a couple things to do it a little bit better, maybe come through again with the finger weeders on the middle row too. But overall, I think it was pretty successful. So then that was 2019, the year that we planted. So this is 2020, this year, when we were managing for the first year. Your management options for weeds are hand pulling, weeding, or hand pulling, string trimming, and then just kind of bush hog mowing. And we had talked in the beginning about maybe being a little concerned about doing a straight kind of bush hog mow as set as high as we can, because it might delay some of the establishment of these plugs. If it went from seed, it's kind of your only option. But since it went from plugs, we were thinking if there's a way to try going from using a string trimmer to be a little bit more surgical and kind of go around the plants that we wanted. So this isn't probably the best example of this, but you can kind of see it between the left and the right. This was from string trimming. You can imagine if I came through just with our bush hog, that it would just be totally clear cut, everything at the same height. So this was with a string trimmer. And we had this kind of strange mustard kind of weed that came up that I don't really see that often. And you can kind of see it to the left and the right of that wild rye that's in the middle. So coming through, and also some foxtail. So I just went through with the string trimmer and just kind of went around the plants as best as I could, so we can still keep that wild rye and that that purple pink aster in there. And it was definitely more time consuming, obviously, than just sitting on a tractor and driving over them, but it worked pretty well. So I did that a couple times in the summer, and then we ended up in the probably late September. We actually came through with we have a 7-foot bush hog and just kind of clear cut it, figuring that most of the plants were in senescence by that point anyway, and just knock back any weeds that we had. One thing I've mentioned is just we're kind of thinking that seeing how it goes over the next year or two and where there might be gaps, we can come through and just put more plugs in those areas and fill in. Okay, this guy is Count de Jean. He was one of Napoleon's generals and widely considered to be the guy who had the largest personal beetle collection in the world. So there's this story about him that at the Battle of Waterloo, he was riding into battle with his troops, and he actually stopped and got off his horse and picked up a beetle off the ground and put it in his helmet, and then got back on and rode into battle. And he apparently, during his time in Napoleon's army, collected beetles across all of Europe. So when he came home, he'd become wealthy through being a general, and he used most of his money to fund beetle finding expeditions around the world. And so when he died, he had amassed this collection of over 100,000 beetles, which represented like 25,000 species. And so I love this picture of him with his, his beetle collection. So I really like this guy. What we should have done, back to beetle banks. I think if I would have done it differently, I would have done that initial tillage pass earlier, maybe like April or May. So we just have more time to do stale bed passes, let more time for weeds to come germinate and be able to knock them back and get a really nice clean seed bed. It's kind of the past couple of years have been like this, where we get a ton of rain in spring and then it's just a total drought. And so I think that's what happened in that year. What I probably would have done was, once it stopped raining, gone through and put some drip lines down and actually irrigated the weeds to try to get those to come up a little bit more and knock them back before planting. And then if I'd done that, I probably would have bumped up our planting to go more June or July, or maybe even early August, to give us both more time to do that mechanical cultivation and also just give more time for those plants to establish in the ground before winter. And then I think to bring down some costs, I would have probably gone through and planted some of our own plugs. Xerces has a publication that talks about, I think we're going to talk about it at the end here, about plants, native plants that are just really easy to grow. And we have greenhouse space and are familiar with growing transplants. So I think we could do that and bring down some of the plug costs. There's those obvious challenges that you're kind of prepared for, like these weeds that just don't go away. There's always going to be unfavorable conditions. You know, it's going to take a lot of time to manage, and worrying about heaving with those plants. The one thing that kind of surprised me, I wasn't prepared for, was with cover crop seeding. Obviously a beetle bank is designed to be next to your field. We primarily do, we have a 3-point broadcast seeder on the back of a tractor that we use to seed our cover crops. And so if you have a beetle bank there, you kind of got to figure out how you're going to not get seed into your beetle bank. So I learned that the hard way the first year, and ended up having rye and vetch come up into our beetle banks this year, which was interesting. It all worked out fine. We ended up just mowing it at anthesis, and it seemed to terminate fine. And then this year in the fall, we ended up having a local farmer come and do and drill the seed into the ground for us. So we didn't have to worry about broadcasting. But that was kind of an unexpected thing I wasn't really planning for. That was a little bit of a surprise. So just one thing to think about. And then the successes of the project. We had really amazing flowers in the first year. I think you put this stuff in the ground, hoping something's going to happen. And we were so close to the frost, the winter, that none of the plants got a chance to really get too big. So you never know what's going to happen. But when those golden Alexanders started popping in the spring, it was like this kind of relief that it worked. And so we had a lot of really cool flowers that came up this year in the first year. So Blazing Star and golden Alexanders and purple clover. And I can never remember what that pink one is, but maybe Sarah does. And then my favorite plant, I'm gonna go to the next slide. Rattlesnake Master came up and was really vigorous and looked awesome. And then some Monarda there too. And then I just thought it was a lot of fun to be able to work with all these people to put this stuff in the ground. We had 15 to 20 people come and be able to spend some time on the farm, putting all these plants in the ground, and feel like they're contributing to like this kind of perennialized long-term vision for habitat on the farm. And so I think just that community social aspect of things was really beneficial for us. And now I'll pass it over to Sarah.
Great, thank you, Jake. I can say from my personal experience, I helped plant all the, well, not all the beetle banks, but the taller stuff and the flowers, and it was a fairly seamless process. Jake had everything super organized, and I just felt like we were able to show up and was like, okay, you put plants here, and it was really amazing. And they planted a lot. The scale of those beetle banks are quite large. So they really took on a huge endeavor, and you know, I just wish the best, and I hope they're super successful, and I enjoy going out there and checking up on them. It's just been, it's been a really awesome experience. So, all right, I'm going to bring it back kind of big picture, more broadly. We spent a lot of time on beetle banks today, but really there are countless options that you can incorporate habitat for pollinators and other wildlife on your farm, on your acreage, within your town, etc. There is a little something for everyone. Okay. Let's see here. Slides aren't communicating with me. And also, you know, we talked about organic site prep today. Grow Johnson County is an organic farm. A lot of the farmers that we work with are organic, and there aren't a lot of organizations or agencies that are really dabbling into organic site prep, but Xerces, we really pride ourselves in trying to accommodate these scenarios. And I think more and more organic site prep is going to become popular and gain momentum as people think more about pesticides and wonder if there are other options. Smother cropping, solarization, and like Jake talked about, repeat cultivation are probably like our top three most commonly used organic site prep methods, but there are lots to choose from. This publication really gets into the nitty-gritty of each of those methods. You know, there's cost analysis, there's case studies. This publication is available on our website, and it's also available at our exhibitor booth. And we mentioned early on just the pros and cons from starting from seed and or transplants. So when we think about doing really large scale habitat work, you know, a half acre or more, for example, seed makes a lot of sense. It really brings the labor down, and it's a lot less expensive. But you can have a little more control if you're at a smaller scale. With plugs, you know, it's a higher cost, but if there are certain species that you want, you can include them, you can put them where you want them, you have that at your disposal, where with seeds, it's just kind of willy-nilly, and they will show up wherever they land and at whatever time they see fit, which could be the first year, it could be 3 years later. So plugs are nice because they're realized instantly, and there's kind of that instant gratification. We have a habitat comparison PDF version of this information that's also in our booth. But if for some reason you can't find it, or later on you realize that you want it, you can always email me and I can share it with you. And also, this is just a list of some native species that are relatively easy to start with. The ones that have asterisks next to them are absolutely the easiest ones because they do not require stratification. Our native forbs, some of them require or really benefit from that freeze thaw you know, activity that goes on in the dormant season over the winter in order to germinate, but not all of them require that. If anyone wants a copy of this information, you can reach out to us and we will provide that. And overall, no matter what you're doing, whether on a farm, whether on your acreage, whether in town, these are just key things that you'll always have to consider, no matter at what scale or, you know, habitat type, etc. So plants native to your region is really critical. They're adapted to your climate. They have co-evolved with the local pollinators and beneficial insects, so those relationships are established. Soil type is critical. Certain plants can only tolerate certain soil types. And there are plants that provide really high levels of nectar or pollen that are crucial, like bergamot, for example, is what we would kind of consider a superfood. We want to be sure that we have blooms and flowers all throughout the season. Native bees, for example, they're very diverse. Iowa has roughly 400 native bee species, and they all emerge at different times and have different needs. So that is why we like to have that spring to fall. Aggressive species or woody species can be beneficial under certain circumstances to help combat weeds, depending on what your current vegetation is that you want to enhance or recreate. And grasses. Again, we get really fixated on flowers, but we can't forget about the grasses because they provide overwintering and nesting habitat. And they're also host plants for a number of Lepidoptera. And diversity. We can't stress diversity enough. The more diversity you have, the better. It helps the stand, maintain for the long haul. It will support a wide variety of beneficial insects, and it can help, resist weed invasion. And I could go on, but that's really, really key. So as Xerces, we are not able to do what we do without those who believe in us and who help fund us. And a huge shout out to all of our members. It's nearly a third of our revenue, and it really makes a difference to help us continue doing what we're doing. Our special thanks to and just utmost gratitude to PFI for partnering with us and allowing us to have a platform and share information, our farm partners, and also a shout out to Iowa NRCS, who helped fund all of our recent beetle bank work that's been going on in the state the last couple of years. But really the farmers, we can't do what we do without you, and to just have you all by our side to say, yeah, let's do something different. Let's try it out. Let's experiment. If we don't have people willing to kind of press the envelope, it's hard to move forward. So we just really appreciate you guys taking the journey along with us. And if you're not currently a member, I would encourage you to be one, and be sure to be a member of PFI if you're not as well. And with that, I think we have time to take some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sarah and Jake, for presenting. We have some awesome questions in the chat here. I'm going to start with the most direct question with probably the easiest answer from Michael Henning. Did the beetle bank work?
So I'm guessing, does that mean have beetles shown up yet? Which is the thing we always hear from. I would say it worked from a perspective of the plants look really good, and I think we're getting good establishment. We didn't really expect to see beetles immediately. It takes a while for the populations to develop, for them to identify that this is a consistent habitat and so on. So from that point, I wouldn't have expected to see a massive increase in beetle populations at this point. So maybe ask me in a year or two. I remember at Grinnell Heritage, Andy, I think I mentioned that it takes saw an increase at maybe somewhere between 3 and 5 years, I think. But we were hoping that with using plugs, we might make that a little bit shorter.
Yeah, and I'll also mention that we thought about including, but didn't, was that we do have some beetle monitoring going on. Throughout 2020, we were kind of put on hold, but in 2019, we partnered with Luther College, who a beetle expert, Dr. Kirk Larson, came in, and we did some pre-planting, just monitoring of beetles, what was already there prior to installing beetle banks. And hopefully in 2021, we can come back and do more monitoring to see, do we have an increase, or are we staying the same? What's going on? We have data back from 3 out of the 4 farms that installed beetle banks in 2019, and we've collected over 1,400 individuals, I think, if I'm remembering that correctly, and each farm has averaged about 29 ground beetle species. So that is what we know currently.
Great. So we have a few technical questions about sizes and things, so I'll try to kind of get those all spouted off here. So Dixon was asking, how far apart can the beetle banks be? 180 feet, 270 feet, and then John Bakehouse asked if you could reiterate how high the bank should be.
Sarah, you might be more, I don't remember the exact specifications on those things.
Yeah, I think as far as distance, between, if you're doing strips, I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that, because I'm not sure if there is research that has really looked at, do they need to be closer together? Can they be further apart from one another? I think it also just depends on the farm and what you have and how much space you have. So I think it's always going to be kind of variable in that regard. Because if you have a smaller farm, maybe you just need them on the ends and that would be sufficient. Part of the beetle bank monitoring is looking into how far they go into the crops from the beetle bank. So perhaps some of that research can help inform those gaps. And then I already forgot what the
height of the raised bed.
Oh yeah, okay. So if you're going to burn, which there are advantages to that, they say at least a foot high, but 1 to 2 feet high is kind of the norm.
And I'll say I don't think we're at that anymore. I think when we formed the bed originally, it probably was somewhere around a foot, but I think it's settled. So
yeah, and I would say I think over time, yeah, that does happen kind of regardless. So
but the intention of that is to create a higher point for the beetles to be, so they can get away from if there's a lot of rain or something. Is that kind of why?
Yeah, and I mean, some people, there's research that suggests that it helps with temperature fluctuations, and there's kind of a debate as to whether that's relevant for the Midwest. There's also non-insects like spiders that are beneficial, that really want to burrow into those raised areas and overwinter. It's also potential, more protection from cultivation. And I guess I've completely forgot that we are crafting a detailed how-to beetle bank fact sheet that hopefully will be coming out in February at the very earliest, likely early March, that will kind of talk about the ins and outs of design, and then a lot of this background information that we're discussing today. So be on the lookout for that.
I'm multitasking here, so maybe you answered this, but Diana Wright was asking about doing this on a very small scale as a small scale gardener or someone who doesn't have fancy equipment. What's the smallest size that is viable?
So I would say, if you have just a garden at home and you want to support pollinators and beneficial insects, whatever diversity you can include in that, whether it's just like, for example, at my house, we have a small kind of herb garden right next to it, next to the house, and like a kitchen garden where we have, small beds of lettuce and things. I planted native plants, just a border of like maybe 2 feet wide in some cases, around 3 out of 4 sides of plants, plugs and seed. And the amount of diversity that I have seen in this past summer that I hadn't seen before, build it and they will come, has really been phenomenal. So I think just anywhere that you have space to just include flowers and or grasses is suitable.
And I would add too, just if you, from like a cultivation standpoint, if you want to do plugs, however you would cultivate your garden, if you use a wheel hoe or stirrup hose or whatever, you could just base your planting. You can still plant it in straight rows with a string line and just a measuring tape to be able to know you're planting at your kind of set design spacing, and be able to manage them however otherwise you'd manage. I guess I wanted to mention that before, but I forgot. But yeah, there's certainly ways to do this and mechanically cultivate without a tractor.
And I should also mention too that we've talked a lot about native plants, but in that really small scale, and especially at home, native plants are best, but including some annuals or some non-native stuff. If you like zinnias, plant some zinnias. If you like marigolds, have some marigolds out there. I know at like Genuine Fox Farm, Rob just loves having his flowers just around, and that they're aesthetically pleasing, and they're not the native plants, but they can still serve a purpose.
All right, I think we've got time for one more question. There's a lot of other great questions, but quickly here. So John Bakehouse had some questions. If you're starting from seed, is establishment and management similar to planting prairie or CRP, etc.? And how susceptible are native species to herbicide drift?
Okay, really great question. So if we're starting from seed, regardless of the amount of space you're using, it's all treated the same with native plants. It's still going to require those establishment mowings. If you're at like a small scale or only doing like 100 square feet or whatever it may be, you could get away with maybe just using like a weed whacker or a string trimmer to, manipulate a mowing, but they all get installed kind of the same and have to be managed the same. And native plants are not resistant, they have no special qualities against herbicides. So some can tolerate certain herbicides better than others, but they are susceptible just like everything else. So like Roundup will kill native plants. The active ingredient for Milestone, which I can't remember, there are native forbs that are tolerable to some degree, and then others that are, extremely susceptible. So.
All right, well, that is all the time that we have for the session today.